Senator Gazelka.
Mr. President, I move that further proceedings under the roll call be dispensed with and the Sergeant of Arms be instructed to bring in the absentee members.
On that motion, all in favor say aye. Opposed say no. The motion prevails and the Sergeant at Arms will bring in the absent members. Members, please stand for the prayer. Today's chaplain is Reverend Pat Williamson from Unity Minneapolis Church. And following the prayer, please remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I invite you to go to that place within your heart and within your mind where you know and you feel God's presence this morning. Join me in our opening prayer. Infinite, invisible Spirit within, we give thanks to know you by many names and many expressions. This morning we are truly blessed to know you as life and love and peace, wisdom and justice. We give thanks that we've been called to do this sacred work at this time, knowing that we are here for a divine purpose and that we are here by divine appointment. We bless each other within this Senate as we do this work together. We pray with and for our families, extended families, and friends as they support us so that we may do the work of this Senate. Today, we also pray with those that we serve, those that we represent. We give thanks that this loving presence within opens the hearts and minds of all of us so that we can remember our oneness with each other and our oneness with the divine. We give thanks in advance that we can reach wise and fair conclusions for all involved. And as we pray, we remember that God is present in all people and in all circumstances. We release any concerns in this prayer, and we place our trust in God. And we know for ourselves, we know for our loved ones, and those that we serve, the prayer for protection. The light of God surrounds us. The love of God enfolds us. The power of God protects us. And the presence of God watches over us. Wherever we are, God is. Thank you, Father, Mother, God, and so it is. Amen.
The Secretary will take the roll.
Senators Abler, Anderson B., Anderson P., Bach, Benson, Bigham, Carlson, Chamberlain, Champion, Clausen, Cohen, Swazinski, Dames, Dibble, Draheim, Dietzig, Eaton, Eichhorn, Eakin, Franzen, Friends, Gazelka, Goggin, Hall, Herr, Hayden, Hoffman, Housley, Howe, Ingebrigtsen, Isaacson, Jasinski, Jensen, Johnson, Kent, Kiffmeyer, Klein, Coran, Lane, Lang, Latz, Limmer, Little, Marty, Matthews, Miller, Nelson, Newman, Newton, Osmic, Pappas, Pratt, Rarick, Ralph, Rest, Rosen, Rude, Senjum, Simonson, Sparks, Tomasoni, Torres, Ray, Utke, Weber, Westrom, Uyghur, Wickland.
A quorum is present. Members will begin on the Senate agenda today with the third order of business, messages from the House. The Secretary will read the message.
Mr. President, I have the honor to announce that the House has appointed a committee of 5 members of the House to act with a similar committee on the part of the Senate to escort the governor to the joint convention to be held in the House chamber on Wednesday, April 3rd, 2019. Said convention to be convened at 6:45 p.m. and said message of the governor to be delivered at 7 o'clock. Kegel, Kotiza, Witoon, Bang, Bowe, and Munson have been appointed on such committee on the part of the House. Patrick D. Murphy, Chief Clerk. Mr. President, I have the honor to announce that the House has adopted the recommendation report of the Conference Committee on Senate File Number 1743 and repassed said bill in accordance with the report of the committee, so adopted. Senate File Number 1743, a bill for an act relating to education. Senate File Number 1743 is herewith returned to the Senate. Patrick D. Murphy, Chief Clerk. Mr. President, I have the honor to announce the passage by the House of the following Senate file herewith transmitted. House File Number 307, a bill for an act relating to public safety, transferring money to the disaster contingency account. Patrick D. Murphy, Chief Clerk, House of Representatives.
There's no further action required on those messages. Moving to the fifth order of business, reports of committee. Members, in addition to the committee reports listed in the agenda, please make note that there's also an addendum. Senator Gazelka.
Mr. President, I move that the committee reports printed in the agenda and addendum be adopted with the exception of the reports pertaining to Joint Rule 2.03.
On the adoption of the committee reports, all those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Motion prevails. Moving to the sixth order of business, second reading of Senate bills. The Secretary will read the Senate file numbers.
Senate File Numbers 1363, 1229, 1753, 342, 173, and 1263.
Second reading. Moving to the seventh order of business, second reading of House bills. The Secretary will read the House file numbers.
House File Number 281.
Second reading. Moving to the eighth order of business, introduction and first reading of Senate bills. Members listed today in the Senate bill introduction calendar are Senate files 2741 through 2770. These bills are given their first reading and referred as indicated. Moving to the ninth order of business, motions and resolutions. There are several authors' motions listed in today's Senate agenda. We will take these authors' motions as one motion. All those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Motion prevails. Continuing under motions and resolutions, Senate Resolution Number 80 will be referred to the Committee on Rules and Administration. The Secretary will read Senate Resolution Number 81.
Senators Gazelka and Bach introduce Senate Resolution Number 81, a Senate resolution relating to appointment of a committee to escort the governor to the House chamber for a joint convention.
Senator Gazelka.
Mr. President, I move that Senate Resolution Number 81 be adopted.
On that motion, all in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Motion prevails. Pursuant to the foregoing resolution, I make the following appointments to escort the governor to the joint convention on April 3rd, 2019. Senators Eaton, Goggin, Isaacson, Rarick, and Rosen. Remaining under motions and resolutions, Senator Gazelka.
Mr. President, pursuant to Rule 26, I designate the following bills to be made for special orders for immediate consideration. Members, the sheet is on your desk.
Members, the first bill up for consideration is number 67 on general orders, Senate File 1339. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, members. Thank you, Mr. President. Senate File 1339 makes light rail transit operators subject to careless and reckless driving laws under Minnesota's traffic code. As you might recall, the need for this legislation was made all too tragically clear by a light rail accident that caused the death of 29-year-old Nick Westlake and severely injured his fiancée, Nellie Petkova. Nick's family and friends are here with us today. They are in the balcony, and on their behalf, I ask for your support for this legislation. Senate File 1339 is a bipartisan bill. I thank the co-sponsors, Senator Lane and Senator Hall. Senate File 1339 passed the Transportation Committee and the Judiciary Committee without amendment or without opposition. The Met Council has testified that it supports this legislation as presented here today. As you might know, and as we all so tragically saw on those traffic cams, Nick and Nellie were traveling in their car together, and they were crossing University Avenue on a green light. The light rail train was traveling on University Avenue. It approached the intersection. There was a red traffic light and the stop signal. The horizontal white bar illuminated. And the operator simply failed to stop. Metro Transit video shows very clearly that both signals were telling the operator to stop. When he drove through those stop signs, the train struck Nick's car. And despite heroic efforts by first responders and bystanders to help Nick and Nellie, Nick died from his injuries. The investigation shows that the operator was at fault, but Minnesota's careless driving statute does not apply to light rail operators. It does apply to vehicles, which excludes devices used exclusively upon stationary rails or tracks. Because of this statute, the operator cannot and was not charged with any crime, not even misdemeanor careless driving. And yet, if he were driving a Metro Transit bus, he would be charged with careless driving. Nick's brothers shared with committee members the conversation that they and their family had with the prosecutors, a conversation where they were told that no charges would be filed even though the evidence clearly showed the driver to be at fault. It is heartbreaking that after the tragedy this family endured, they could not even receive the small comfort that some level of justice would come. The bill before us today simply makes the reckless and careless driving statutes apply to light rail operators. Now, if passed, the operator who caused this accident, of course, cannot be charged post facto. But I believe, and Nick's family believes, that we need to change the law to prevent and deter a senseless tragedy like this from happening again. Nick's family and friends have worked tirelessly since the accident to bring attention to this need for increased safety around the light rail system. This bill is the first step in that process. Now, it will not prevent every accident, but hopefully by passing this bill today, we can take the first step towards bringing some small good that can come out of this senseless tragedy. Family members are here today. Nick Westlake was a shining light in our communities. He was a wonderful ballroom dancer, a generous volunteer, and of course a loving member of his family. A number of his family members have come to the Capitol today to support this legislation. Lisa and Bob Westlake, Nick's parents, are here today. Pete and Seth Westlake, Nick's brothers are here today. And Christine Redlin, Nick's grandmother, is here today. Members, I ask for a strong green vote in support of this needed change in the Minnesota Traffic Code that can prevent future tragic incidences such as befell Nick and his fiancée.
Further discussion on Senate File 1339, Senator Lane.
Thank you, Mr. President. A constituent of mine contacted me about the loophole in the law that made no fault for the careless driving of the light rail operator in regards to Nick's death. I worked with them to draft the bill that is before us today, and I thank Senator Nelson for carrying it forth in the body. Please, members, vote green for Nick Westlake.
Any further discussion on Senate File 1339? Senator Senjum.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the Senator Nelson yield?
The author will yield. Senator Senjum.
Senator Nelson, just a question. I probably should have asked this in Transportation Committee, but it didn't really occur to me until last night as I was going through the bills. If I run at red light, it's a petty misdemeanor, I believe. This would, in the case of an operator of a light rail train, it becomes a misdemeanor if that person runs a red light. What about a Metro Consul bus? Would they be held to the same standard, given they're both, operators of a public transit system? Does the bus running a red light, are they subject to a different ticket, if you will, a different level of crime than the light rail operator?
Senator Nelson.
Mr. President, it was too noisy. I'm afraid I could not hear all of Senator Senjum's question. So if he could rephrase that, please, and speak into the mic so I can hear the full question, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Senator Senjum.
Thank you, thank you, Senator Nelson, Mr. President. The question really boils down to is the penalty for the light rail operator now running a red light, it's going to be a misdemeanor. And again, they are operators of a public transit system. Does that same level of penalty apply to a Metro bus operator who might run a red light, since they also are operating a public transit system?
Senator Nelson.
In other words, do we have equality on this?
Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President and Senator Senjum. The bill before us today would simply put light rail under the careless driving statute, which currently does not apply to light rail operators. It appears that some of our statutes were updated with the advent of light rail. This particular one was not.
Any further discussion on Senate File 1339? The Secretary will give Senate File 1339 its third reading.
Senate File number 1339, a bill for an act relating to transportation.
Third reading. Any final discussion on the bill? Seeing no further discussion, the Secretary will take the roll on Senate File 1339. All senators having voted who have the desire to vote, the Secretary will close the roll. There being 65 ayes and 0 nays, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. Members, the next bill up for consideration is number 111 on general orders, House File 400, Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. House File 400, or as you have known this whole year, Senate File 751, is Minnesota's response to a very serious public health emergency. Opioid addiction is tearing the Minnesota families apart statewide and threatening to completely overwhelm our public health system, law enforcement, our public safety budgets, the court system, the workplace, the loss of prime age workforce because of addiction, and the costs to our hospitals for uncompensated care in the emergency room. The list goes on and on with the cost. Currently, members, just came out, opioid overdose deaths have now surpassed deaths of car accidents. And nearly 80% of heroin users started with prescription opioids. So this bill, members, brings all the stakeholders to the table. The state is one of the stakeholders, and we are committed to addressing this crisis. The prescribers, the medical community, the pharmacists, dentists, law enforcement is in here, along with the Pollution Control Agency, and especially the treatment community has been addressed in here. And most important, we have brought a very important stakeholder to the table, and that is the pharmaceutical companies, the manufacturers, the wholesalers, and distributors. The state responsibilities, members, is very important because we've heard, what does the state have in this besides the tremendous cost that it's costing everybody, the taxpayers, the counties. But the funding in this bill is for treatment of proven effective programs like the ECHO program at St. Gabriel's and Little Falls and HCMC. We're also funding prevention through public awareness and education campaign through the Opiate Advisory Council. There's continuing education for the prescriber. There's the ability to reduce doctor shopping through an investment in the prescription monitoring program. And we're supporting the counties with their efforts on the cost by helping them with their out-of-home placement costs. And members, you can talk to every single county, and their out-of-home placement costs for children and families is skyrocketing. And that is a direct correlation to what is happening with illicit drugs and addiction. We have money in here for the violent crime enforcement teams, the VSET teams, to get at those illicit drugs that are coming in on our highways and our interstate. And this will be primarily for Greater Minnesota, but we have to stop the flow of these illegal drugs coming in. And members, this is all under the guise of results first, to make sure that we know where the money is going, if it's being used appropriately, and most importantly, if we are getting the results for our state investment. So the bill, members, House File 400 starts with a licensing fee increase that's going to generate $20 million. And currently, for anybody doing business in Minnesota in the pharmaceutical industry, whether you're a manufacturer, distributor, wholesaler, you pay $235 per year. $235 per year to do business in Minnesota. So we are increasing that to $5,000 for a licensure fee for all pharmaceutical wholesalers and distributors, and manufacturers. An additional $50,000 licensure fee for anybody who is a manufacturer of an opiate of Schedule 2 through 4. And if you are producing and selling and distributing in Minnesota over 2 million units of opiates, members, that's a lot of opiates, in Minnesota, you will be paying a $250,000 registration fee, so a total of $305,000. These fees will be deposited in a special revenue account, and there is a reports that are required by the Board of Pharmacy and the legislature. And members, I just want to make sure you know that there is a huge state lawsuits and just municipal lawsuits against the pharmaceutical companies. Oklahoma was just settled on a huge lawsuit. But these fees are reasonable, they're spread across, they're much different than what we had last year in the bill. It's not a penny a pill, and they seem to be fair for everybody. But you're going to hear some argument from a pharmaceutical company that it's not fair. Well, not fair is what the state is paying for this issue. Not fair is for the families that are affected by this issue. So the $20 million that's being generated will be under the Opioid Epidemic Response Advisory Council, which has been established to develop and implement a comprehensive and effective statewide effort focused on prevention and education, treatment, innovation, and capacity building. The Council shall review local, state, and federal initiatives, establish priorities, and consult with MMB, ensure alignment with federal dollars that are coming in for greatest impact, and develop the criteria in awarding grants. And, of course, all under the guise of results first. It's an 18-member board. The report to the legislature. And members on the board, just briefly, it's, as I said, an 18-member board, and they have 2 members from the House, 2 members from the Senate, 1 member appointed by the Board of Pharmacy, 1 member who is a physician appointed by the Minnesota chapter of the American College of Emergency Physicians, 1 member from the Sober Living Programs, 1 member from the Minnesota Hospital Association, a member from the Minnesota Society of Addiction Medicine, a pain psychologist, a member from the Steve Rumler Hope Network, a member from the Ambulance Association, from the court system who is a judge or law enforcement officer, and 1 public member who is a Minnesota resident who has been impacted by the opioid epidemic, and 1 public member who is in opioid addiction recovery, a member who is a manufacturer of opiates, a member representing Indian tribes, and 1 public member who is a Minnesota resident who is suffering from chronic pain, intractable pain, or a rare disease condition. And then, of course, commissioners of Human Services and Health that are ex officio non-voting members. In this account, there are some funds that go out for the results first, administration of DHS, for the Board of Pharmacy to collect the registration fee. But there's 3 new BCA scientists in here, for forensic scientists, and there's funding to continue the wonderful work that St. Gabriel's and Little Falls and HCMC are doing with Project ECHO. The remaining 50% of the money will go to county social services to provide child protection services to children and families who are affected by addiction. And DHS will do a proportional to what the open child protection cases are from the previous year. And members, I want to just say the top 10 counties on a per capita basis that have been hardest hit are Aitkin, Isanti, Itasca, Kennebec, Couchiching, Mille Lacs, Pine, Pipestone, Traverse, Wadena, Beltrami's in there. So, and the remaining funds will be awarded through the council and approved by the legislature. There is language in here in the sunset provision, which is found on page 12 of the House File 20, and that is basically a one-time appropriation from the settlement of $20 million to a special revenue fund, and then it allows the legislature to look at the fees ongoing. But the intent is to lower those fees once there's a $20 million, at least $20 million that's pulled from the settlement and put into the special revenue fund to make sure that those programs are ongoing and dollars are provided. We also have some language in here from the PCA about disposal of unused, unwanted pharmaceuticals. And members, there's a chart from Hennepin County, has my name on it, of the pounds collected of unused, unwanted, expired medications from 2018, just in Hennepin County alone, 22,512 pounds, just in 2018. There's requirements in here for prescribing of opioids, such as no prescription dispensed more than 30 days after a prescription is allowed, and any subsequent refills of more than 30 days after previous date. There needs to be additional authorizations if the continued therapy is required. This bill addresses acute pain requirements, and we limit it to a 7-day supply for adults and 5 days for minors. Along with dental, we do not need a 30-day supply for a molar extract. And the reason I point out the acute versus the chronic, and there has been a lot of discussion about chronic pain, is that we allowed our prescribers professional clinical judgment, the standards of care, to make sure that the patients receive the care and the relief from their pain that is necessary. There's a prescription monitoring program in here, and when you're accessing that data, it must be used for Schedule 2 through 4 opiates at least once every 3 months for patients receiving opiate for chronic pain or participating in the medically assisted treatment program. But it does not apply for people that are in hospice or palliative care, that are being treated for pain due to cancer, have a dosage day of 5 days or less and no refill. They have an ongoing relationship with the patient and provider, which is longer than 1 year. So that prescriber knows this patient, knows what their situation is. Does not apply if the prescription issued within 14 days following surgery or 3 days oral surgery. It does not apply if the patient is admitted in the hospital or if it's been lawfully administered by injection and ingestion. Does not apply due to a medical emergency or if you are unable to access the system due to failure. There's money in here to fund the prescription monitoring program, and its prescriber and pharmacist would pay $50 per user per annual fee. There's 2 hours of continuing ed for prescribers on the issue of opioid prescribing improvement program. And members, we've seen a decrease in the number of opioids that have been prescribed, but we are seeing an increase in the number of deaths. And for every death, we have had at least 5 visits to the ER room. There's a section in here for alternative pain management, which is Senator Abler's language for his committee to evaluate and make recommendations on integration of non-pharmacological pain management, and they'd report to the legislature by 2021. Another very important piece is $2 million per year ongoing general fund dollars. Our commitment to this, to the violent crime enforcement teams, the VSET teams, prioritizing Greater Minnesota. They have not seen an increase in their funds since 2011, and we need to get more boots on the ground. We need to stop the illicit drugs coming in, the heroin, the opioids, the synthetic fentanyl, the methamphetamine. Methamphetamine has seen a 700% increase in seizures in this past year, 700%. So we need more support out in the field. And then there's money for the Board of Pharmacy for informational technology and operating costs for licensing the administration part of it, and $500,000 for the Board of Pharmacy operation. And members, I just want to point out a few things. There's a handout on your desk from Hennepin County, and all you need to do is talk to your own county. But Hennepin County we've all been terribly hit by this. But a decade ago, HCMC would see 6 to 12 pregnant women in treatment for opioid addiction per year. Last year, they averaged 6 to 12 per day. And over the last 3 years, there's been an 88% increase in children 5 and under removed from their homes due to parental drug use, and 72% increase in out-of-home placement cost. Hennepin County spends over $122 million on child protection per year. $50 million of that is for out-of-home placement and growing at a rate of $6 million per year. Members, this is unsustainable. This is one county. As I said, the state has stepped up to their part. All the stakeholders have been around the table trying to figure out what we can do, what tools we can implement. And this bill, House File 400, is something that I think the public, the state of Minnesota, is absolutely demanding. Thank you.
Discussion on House File 400. Senator Jensen.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Rosen, for bringing this bill forward. As you can imagine, over the last few weeks, I've been asked by many colleagues and here in the Senate what my thoughts are on this bill. I would just say this. If you look at the gross net profit of the pharmaceutical manufacturers, what this bill is asking for is go ahead and put a $100 bill on your desk, and we're asking for a penny. We're asking for a penny. I think that if you're concerned about what kind of an impact this is going to have on the pharmaceutical industry regarding the manufacturers in terms of innovation and things like that, it won't have any. This bill does try to get at more of the supply chain than you might realize, and there are separate pieces of legislation that are moving through the pipeline that will get at the pharmacy benefit managers and things like that. We know that wholesalers and distributors aren't lily white on this, if you will. They've also done some things that could have been avoided. This bill has bipartisan support, and certainly the opiate deaths have been indiscriminate as to who they afflict. We've incrementally moved on this topic over the last 3 years, but it is time to move it across the goal line. The question comes up, is this cost going to be passed on to the end user, to the patient? It's possible. But you know what? It's, again, a penny out of a $100 bill. This crisis isn't just affecting opiates. It's affecting virtually every aspect of the process of a physician taking care of a patient. The bill provides for the adequate taking care of people in chronic pain, on hospice, with cancer. It allows physicians to go ahead and use a 5-day course of narcotics for severe gout or kidney stone. Senator Rosen has thoughtfully gone to many persons and taken their advice, and sometimes she didn't maybe go to them. We had to go to her, but she listened to us. Trust me, going to Senator Rosen with an idea that she doesn't like and maybe doesn't want to include on her bill isn't the easiest thing to do. But I've done it, and she's listened. So with no hesitation whatsoever, I support this bill, and I think we'd send the right message by voting in a profoundly bipartisan fashion to get this bill to the governor's desk. Thank you.
Further discussion on the bill, Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Senator Jensen, for your work on this. There's many people to thank that I will address that later, but I do have the A3 amendment, Mr. President, that I got buried in my pile. But this does...
Hold on, Senator Rosen. Senator Rosen offers the A3 amendment. The Secretary will report the amendment.
Senator Rosen moves to amend House File Number 400, the unofficial engrossment as follows, page 11, line 13. This is the A3 amendment.
To the amendment, Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, this does adjust some of the concerns that were addressed in the Finance Committee. One was by Senator Kiffmeyer because of the money that is going to the county social services to make sure that there is some accountability, that they must report to the commissioner how the funds were used to provide child protection services, including measurable outcomes as determined by the commissioner. So that is being added to the bill. And also the issue that Senator Marty and others have brought up about the sunset provision, that there will be a continual $20 million in the fund to make sure that we are able to pay for those issues as our treatment programs and our commitment to the counties. And then there is some adjustment of how the money is being transferred, that it's in 2020 money is transferred from the general fund account to pay for the obligations that we have in the amendment. And then if there's a settlement, it'll go back into the general fund.
Any discussion on the A3 amendment? Seeing none, Senator Frentz.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Will Senator Rosen yield for a question?
Senator Rosen will yield. Senator Frentz.
Senator Rosen, thank you for your work on this bill. My question is about the sunset in the A3 amendment. Am I understanding correctly that the change in the fees in the bill will go away at 20 million, but could return in order to prevent the fund from going below 20 million? Thank you.
Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator France. Yes, that is. It gives us a legislative session to look at the fees, see if they need to go up, if need to adjust them, but they will always remain at $5,000, which, by the way, is a heck of a deal.
Any further discussion on the A3 amendment? Senator Marty.
Mr. President, Senator Rosen, for clarification on it, again, that one provision, I'm trying to read this in the right way. The first 20 million received goes into the account, and then after that goes in the general fund, and the funding for the program then is taken care of for one more year after the settlement, and then it cuts down to the lower level.
Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Senator Marty, for the question. Yes, it's a one-time appropriation, and we have another legislative session to take a look at the makeup of those fees ongoing, depending on if there is a settlement.
Any further discussion on the A3 amendment? Seeing none, all those in favor of the A3 say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. The motion prevails. The amendment is adopted. Further discussion on House File 400, Senator Eaton.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wanted to talk about some of the things that got us here today. I've been working on this bill for 3 years, the last 2 with Senator Rosen, who I'm very grateful for carrying this bill so well for us. She's championed it, and I couldn't ask for a better partner in this bill. A lot of this we got to because in 2001, the Purdue Pharmacy talked the FDA into changing the labeling on opioids, that they were acceptable to be prescribed for chronic pain, daily, around-the-clock, long-term treatment. And the memo in the Purdue was the action by the FDA has created enormous opportunities to expand the market. And the drug companies' ads soon extolled the virtues of OxyContin's effectiveness, and sales tripled. Up until that time, these medications were used for acute pain, people with cancer who were dying, people post-surgery, things like that. After that ruling, they started to be prescribed for sprained ankles, tooth extractions, back pain, anything that arthritis. And as the letter from Dr. Resnikoff that I handed out, as he says, that a world with opioids is a world with opioid addiction. Not everybody who uses them will become an addict. Not everyone who uses them will develop the disease of addiction, but 6 to 20%, depending on the study, will. And the problem is, as of today, we don't have the services and the supports available for those people for that side effect of opioids. We find results for everything else. I know that some of the main opioid manufacturers now have a drug specifically for constipation caused by opioids. I mean, every other side effect has been dealt with, but we don't have one for the side effect of addiction. We've been trying to fit people with the disease of opioid addiction into the alcohol treatment system, and it's not working real well. Although we have managed to save a lot of lives. The previous bill, Steve's Law, made naloxone available throughout the county or state, and we saved over 2,000 people documented in reversing their overdoses. we know that 50 to 70% of the reversals are done by friends or family members outside the hospitals or ambulance systems. So we've probably saved, conservatively, 4,000 to 5,000 people. The problem with that is that if you read in Appendix K of SAMHSA and CMS, that they allocate their response grants by the criteria of dependence, abuse, or drug poisoning deaths. So because we save so many people, we get fewer federal dollars. It's one of the reasons why this bill is critical. I don't want people to have to die so that we get our share of money to take care of those with addiction. Today is a significant day to me. It's the daughter, Ariel, that I lost to opioid addiction. It would have been her 35th birthday today. So I think that it's an appropriate day that we're taking up this bill. And I want to dedicate this bill and the work that Senator Rosen and I have done together to all those who've lost their lives to opioid addiction. There's way too many to name, but of course, I would have to mention Steve Rumler and Cassie Joe and Dan Baker and all of those who, Michaela, I mean, there's too many to name, unfortunately, but they're all here in my heart. I hear their stories from their parents, and they all stay with me. Most of them were waiting for treatment. Most of them developed their addiction when they were prescribed opioids for a sports injury or a very painful disease, medical condition, and developed the addiction and couldn't get into treatment. Most of them had a 3-week wait. And the urges and the addiction of opioids was just too much for them to handle on their own, waiting. And they ended up, generally after losing some tolerance, using again and overdosing. The heartbreak is indescribable, having been there myself. I can tell you after 12 years, it's still there, but I'm used to it. You just learn to live with it. And, you know, I'd like to tell those who are just now experiencing it that it gets easier, but it doesn't really. You just learn to make it as part of your life, because my life will never be the same as it was before the day that Ariel died. And I am so grateful to everybody who's worked on this bill, from the Steve Rumler Hope Network to Valhalla to March to, you know, Lexi Reed Holtum and Randy Anderson and Shelley. And I just thank you, Senator Rosen, from the bottom of my heart. And I thank all of you ahead of time for your vote and support of this bill. Thank you.
Further discussion to the bill, Senator Marty.
Thank you, Mr. President. This bill is a long time coming, and it's an urgent need. There's still more than 1 Minnesotan a day dying from opioid addiction, and one that didn't have to happen. It was because of some pharmaceutical companies, especially Purdue, that started marketing deceptively, knowingly deceptively. It's killed 250,000 Americans. And I really appreciate the thoughtful approach to this bill, the years of work that have gone into it by Senator Eaton, Senator Rosen, and others. And I appreciate the A3 amendment, which helped reduce one of the weaknesses in the bill, but I do have the A4 amendment at the desk, Mr. President.
Senator Marty offers the A4 amendment. The Secretary will report the Marty amendment.
Senator Marty moves to amend House File Number 40, the unofficial engrossment as follows, page 12, delete Section 9. This is the A4 amendment.
To the amendment, Senator Marty.
Thank you, Mr. President. The A3, this amendment is a simple one. It simply removes the sunset from the bill. The A3 made it so that the first money that comes in a settlement would go to this, so we'd have an extra year to try and reestablish the program. But watching the pain of everything of getting this bill through the first time, and we're not there yet, but getting this bill through the first time through the legislature has been a 3-year process. And we're not putting that much money into it. We're putting $20 million, which is $3.50 or so per Minnesotan. And putting that $3.50 a year into a problem that has cost taxpayers hundreds of dollars per person is what we might call a drop in the bucket, a very important drop in the bucket, one I think we all support. But the way the Senate bill is worded, the House bill is different in this way, and I think it's an improvement in the House bill. But I don't think we should pass it out of here the same way, the way it is right now, where there's any kind of a sunset in this. This is an ongoing problem, and addiction doesn't go away because you wait a year. And opioids are out there with many Minnesotans who are addicted to them. And almost before the bill takes effect, there's likely to be a settlement coming in. Oklahoma, what was it, $270 million from one company, from Purdue Pharma, the worst of the offenders. But that's supposed to be penalizing them for what they did wrong, for behavior that, if it wasn't criminal, sure ought to have been criminal. And I'm not an attorney, but it sure seems to be criminal to me. But that settlement is supposed to punish them for what they did wrong. This bill is supposed to fund all these programs and services. And because the A3 amendment, now we're guaranteed at least 1 year before we have to come back and draw the money back. We're going to have the same fight all over again. I think in Finance Committee, Sarah Rosen said she wasn't sure she liked the sunset, but felt there were others who were pressing her to do that. But I'd say this is the kind of issue that we've got to stand up to the pressure on and say, no, we're going to fund this ongoing $20 million a year, which again I'd say is on the low, very low end of what the problem is. But we're going to fund this on an ongoing basis. We're not going to step back because our Attorney General can win some money in court, money which is deserved for the people of Minnesota to pay their costs, pay for some of the harm and the hardship. And Chris's daughter Ariel is one of thousands of Minnesotans dying from this. This is something we ought to just say, we're going to do it, and we're going to do it right now. And all this does is say, if we have the lawsuit and there's a settlement, that's what the courts decided is appropriate for those companies. But this $20 million here, paid for on an ongoing basis, is something we ought to do, we need to do, and there's no reason to tell all the groups that have the funding that, oh, don't worry, we'll come back in a year and we'll try and get it back within a year so you don't lose the funding that was so hard fought for all the first time. It seems to me we ought to just do it, keep it in place. If we win a lawsuit, great. That can be used for other things to help address opioid problem. But this $20 million is a bare minimum for what we need out there. Let's not take it away with it. I urge your support for the amendment and ask for a roll call.
A roll call has been requested. A roll call will be granted. Discussion on the A4 amendment. Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Mr. President. And members, House File 400, Senate File 751 is not to be viewed as a penalty. It's viewed to have accountability for the issue, for this crisis that we're bringing forward. And I truly look at the increased licensing fee as an accountability measure and what's proper for the pharmaceutical industry to pay to do business in Minnesota. But I do believe that a sunset is mandatory, especially because of a possible pending settlement from the federal government and from the pharmaceutical industry. We'll have an ongoing $12 million because the licensing fee is always going to remain at $5,000 ongoing. And then we'll have the settlement on top of it. And I think it's proper that it comes back to the legislature for review. So, members, I ask that you vote against the A4 amendment.
To the amendment, Senator Marty.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Rosen, I really agree with the first part of what you said. This bill is not punishment. This bill is funding the needs we have out there because of a dangerous class of drugs. This bill is funding what Minnesota needs to fund. And instead of having the taxpayers pay for it, it's coming out of the folks who are selling and making a profit from selling the drugs. It's not a penalty, I agree. The lawsuit's the penalty. The lawsuit's the one where they're being penalized for what they did wrong. That has nothing to do with this. This ought to go on because, as you said, it's not a penalty, it's something that needs to continue. Your first part of your argument made the strongest argument possible for why we ought to adopt this amendment. This is not a penalty. This is an ongoing bill. This is funding the services that people in Minnesota desperately need for the counties, for child protection, make sure our drugs are used in an appropriate way, they're not overused, make sure we have a good system for preventing more addiction from happening. All of that's very important, so I strongly agree with the first part of your statement, but the second part made no connection to the first part. The second part made no sense. This is not the penalty. The penalty comes from that, and it should have nothing to do with this. Yes, we can always look at it again. If we get a lot of money from the industry, we want to use some of that money to replace this, we can decide that. But this is a question of taking a hard-fought fight and saying, oh, well, you know, if we get more money in, we'll use it that way. I remember a tobacco settlement the state won, $600 million. It was supposed to be used for tobacco cessation and other things. Well, at a certain point, the legislature and governor just decided to sell some of that off, use it for other purposes. Let's lock this in, that we have this urgent need for treatment, we have this urgent need for prevention, we have this urgent need for response in crises. We have this urgent need for addressing child abuse and child neglect caused by opioids. This is a bill, this funding is needed regardless of that lawsuit, and that lawsuit has nothing to do with this, so I strongly urge you to support the amendment. And Senator Rosen, if you think we're getting too much money from that and we can do this, and you can come back and cut the funding for opioids next year by $8 million if you think that's appropriate. I don't think you'd offer a bill next year to cut it back by $8 million because I think you know we need the money.
Members, just a friendly reminder to address the president when speaking on the floor. Members, any additional discussion on the A4 amendment? Seeing none, the secretary will take the roll on the amendment. All senators having voted who have the desire to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There being 29 ayes and 36 nays, the motion does not prevail. The amendment is not adopted. Further discussion on House File 400. Members, I have a long list here that I'm working off of. Next on the list is Senator Klein. Senator Klein passes. Senator Benson. Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I want to thank Senator Rosen. If you want to see how hard work gets done on a bill, you watch Julie Rosen. And to Senator Eaton, who has been an incredibly faithful partner through this. Members, those of you who are on the committees this bill traveled through heard me vote no. And I think Senator Rosen knows why, but I want to state publicly, it isn't because I don't think the work needs to be done, and it isn't because pharmaceutical companies should get away with misleading the public. I think that can be handled in courts, but I also think they bear some responsibility for the mess that we're in. The babies born addicted, the coroner's office overwhelmed with addiction overdoses. There's one thing that's missing in this bill, and this isn't a good reason to vote no, but it kind of piles on. Doctors aren't held accountable. Are we asking doctors to pay for any of this? They were the ones handing out scripts. And I made that clear last year when the bill went through. Really disappointing, and I know Senator Rosen's trying to get this through and get it to a point where the bill is workable, and it's not her fault that they're not in there. There just weren't enough votes to hold doctors accountable. And so I hope at some point the prescriber community has some skin in the game for the cost of the mess that we're in. My bigger concern is that the fees that we're charging on some of the small manufacturers raise the cost per unit to approaching $900 per unit, which means they probably will not continue to do business in Minnesota, which is fine. If you don't want them doing business in Minnesota, then this would be a way to get them out. The problem is we counted those fees as receipts, and it will make a hole in the general fund. And I know Senator Rosen's aware of this, but I wanted to stand up and talk about this specifically as something I think needs to be handled as it comes out of conference committee. And so I will be a polite no on the bill today and thank Senator Rosen for her work.
Further discussion on the bill, Senator Limmer.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the author yield for a question?
Senator Rosen will yield. Senator Limmer.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Rosen, I've only heard this bill in 2 committees, and sometimes it was a very narrow discussion pertaining to the jurisdiction of that particular committee. And I just had a few questions regarding the fees, or do we call them fines? I'm not sure what it may be. Some people may consider them a little bit of both, but when a fee is charged to the manufacturer, is that the only place where a fee is charged? Or will there be a fee charged to, let's say, the wholesale distributor? Or will it be charged to a medical facility of some sort that a doctor prescribes from? Could you clear that one up for me, please?
Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am looking for the language that says that it shall be for one location in Minnesota. And as I said, it's on page 6, lines 6, 18 through 23, except a manufacturer opiate containing controlled substance shall not be required to pay fees for more than one facility. So if you are a pharmaceutical manufacturer, distributor, or wholesaler, you automatically pay $5,000 increased licensing fee. I do not consider that a fine. I consider that the ability to do business in Minnesota. And it's, as I said before, and somewhat, and I don't mean to be flippant, but that is a very good deal to do business in Minnesota, especially when a liquor license in downtown Minneapolis could be up to $30,000. If you are an opioid manufacturer, you'll be paying $50,000 increase, and then the $5,000 on top of that. If you manufacture and distribute more than 2 million units in the state, then you will be paying $250,000 plus the 55. The 50 plus the 5,000. So it's a total of $305,000. And as I said, that is until the settlement comes into place and everyone will be dropped down to $5,000.
Senator Limmer.
Thank you, Mr. President. One other question for Senator Rosen.
Senator Rosen will continue the yield. Senator Limmer.
Senator Rosen, I'm not really well versed in the exact language of your bill, but with that description that you just read us, let me take perhaps maybe an absurd example. If one manufacturer only sold one unit of an opioid, one capsule, would they be charged that same dollar amount?
Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Senator Limmer, yes, they would. The licensing fee, they have to have a licensing fee to manufacture that one opiate in the state, and I would assume that's a very specialized, very expensive piece of opiate, and it would be a $5,000, actually it'd be $50,000 if it's an opiate. If it's a pharmaceutical company, it's $5,000.
Senator Limmer.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm done with questions, but I do have something to say about this. Only recently have I been given the responsibility of taking care of a loved one's pharmaceutical needs and oversee that. And one of those pharmaceutical products costs over $9,000 a month for the cost of it. It's not an opioid, but the cost is exceptionally high for a specialty drug. And as I look at the cost and I look at the patient's needs, we can't help but want to give them comfort. We want to give them, if they can't give a cure, we want to make sure that they're comfortable. And when we look at the opioid industry and the problem that we see with opioids and the deaths and that we have begun to experience and realize in the state of Minnesota, there's something in us that demands some kind of justice. And I'm trying to determine where does that justice eventually rest. And I'm having a little bit of a difficulty because there's a long path between the manufacturer of the product, government regulators, doctors, medical communities, and also eventually that path leads to the individual patient. And I'm trying to determine where does the responsibility rest. I'm not going to use the word blame, but that could be used. But the steps along the way that I recognize as a manufacturer, perhaps the fast speed up approval recently by the FDA on some of these products, perhaps the prescribers, as it was mentioned by Senator Benson, or perhaps the medical protocol of certain medical organizations that direct doctors to prescribe in certain ways. And I have to ask the question, are we really hitting the mark by focusing on one entity and one entity only? And that raises some questions in my mind. And the other question is, what are the consequences that could occur? I personally think that it's going to hit generic manufacturers in the state of Minnesota a little harder than the brand companies that sell the same product at many, many, many times more for the same product. And the generics serve a useful purpose. In the life of that product, they eventually get to the point where they can sell it to the general public at a far, far discount. And usually that very low discount means they have a very low profit margin. And so the fees may affect them a little bit more than affecting the brand companies. And quite honestly, I think that the generics, some of them may be in danger of considering whether they should do business in the state of Minnesota. And maybe some of us don't think that's a bad idea. Maybe they should go. But nevertheless, I don't, because I think ultimately they serve a greater good in the products that they offer. But if it did happen, then the brand companies come back and the price goes up. And I'm very concerned about the market reaction to this. But I do recognize the issue that we are dealing with. We're kind of making a judgment today. I don't think representational branches of government do that well because of the populist reaction that we have. And this has, as yet, I don't think, gone to any court in the state of Minnesota. But as I look at it, I also realize, in the interest of public safety, this body has to react. This may not be the perfect solution, but it is a solution. It's a path in the right direction. It's a movement that I think the whole legislature has begun to agree that there's a serious issue, and we in the interest of public safety, cannot ignore the harm and the death to our citizens. So I will be supporting this, but I think we have a little bit more work to do in the future on how to define this issue a little bit better and define who ultimately is responsible for it. And that I don't think we're getting to. But I will be voting for it. But I do have concerns about this legislation.
Further discussion on House File 400, Senator Jasinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. I stand in support of House File 400. I want to say thank you to Senator Rosen, Senator Eaton in the Senate, as well as Representative Baker in the House, who've done a lot of work on this. I've worked with Senator Rosen on a lot of bills, and I know if there's something that needs to get done, Senator Rosen takes charge and gets it done. No matter where we go in our communities, we hear of this need. Every post office or grocery store, this is one thing that always comes up. This is something we need to get done and work for the state of Minnesota to correct the problem that has risen from this problem. So thank you very much.
Further discussion, Senator Swedzinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Rosen, Senator Eaton. I rise in support of this bill as well. I've been out of the classroom now for 3 years, and I run into all my ex-students in their 20s, and I'm excited to hear about how the school went, whether they went to college or VOTAC, and how their careers are going, and how their love lives are progressing, and how they're building their families or buying their homes, and they're finally realizing the American dream that for so many years has been part of the American psyche. But for far too many of my ex-students, they've realized the American nightmare rather than the American dream because of the continual crisis called opioid addiction. When I first got elected to this stellar body, I ran into a family of ex-students. I asked them how their son was doing, and they looked at me and they started crying because he's got a sports injury when he was in high school. And one thing led to another, and they found him in a hotel room in Eden Prairie with a needle stuck in his arm, dead. I was at a funeral of a friend last spring, and ran into a mother of an ex-student. And she comes up to me and she goes, "Swat, how you doing?" And I looked at her because I didn't quite place her. and all of a sudden she told me who she was. And I asked her, oh my God, how's your daughter doing? And she started crying because she had to tell me her daughter just died, again, of an opioid addiction. And last year in my office here in the state Senate, I had a meeting with a parent of an ex-student of mine who's a constituent, and she comes into my office and she sits down, she shows me a picture of her son. And I'm like, oh my God, how's he doing? And she started crying and she said the St. Paul police found my son with a needle in his arm, slumped over in his car here in St. Paul. These are just 3 anecdotes, 3 stories of 3 families. All those families should be doing what all of us had the opportunity to do in our 20s, but unfortunately, they've lost that. They'll never be able to realize what we all want to accomplish in this brief thing called life. Senator Marty rose up and he said this bill's been a long time coming. I don't want to stand here in a year or 2 or years from now and tell more stories of this crisis. I hope today this puts a stop to the opioid crisis. Thank you, Mr. President.
Further discussion on House File 400, Senator Franzen.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the A50 amendment.
Senator Franzen offers the A50 amendment. The Secretary will report the Franzen amendment.
Senator Franzen moves to amend House File Number 400, the unofficial engrossment as follows. Page 26, delete lines 2 to 15. This is the A50 amendment.
To the amendment, Senator Franzen.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Rosen, I do support your work in this bill, and Senator Eaton, my condolences again. You're a colleague and friend, and I'm voting for this bill because of you. And you know, this bill has gone through a lot. It's been being worked on for a couple of years at least, and obviously, with the testimony today, we've heard of the stories for many, many, many years affecting every part of our state and many of our constituents. I've served on the Health and Human Services Committee where I've heard different versions of this bill, including the one today, and it's been changed in every single committee stop. I do have to, you know, as policymakers, look at the appropriation side and whether you call it a fee, a price of doing business, a tax, it's still raising revenue, and I need to question where that revenue is going. And in committee, I remember Senator Rosen, Mr. President, Senator Rosen, you mentioning that you do spend a lot of money, and I can see some of the connections and the correlations between the spend and this issue of opiate addiction and crisis. But some of it still is confusing to me, or at least doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of correlation. The $10 million for child protection with families that have dealt with this issue makes sense to me. It's a big number, but there's tons of funding that has gone from our counties to serve this issue at the county level, so I do support that. There's registration fees collected, and there's money going to the Board of Pharmacy at a tune of $126,000, $300,000 for MMB evaluation costs, $249,000 to DHS for administrative services, $384,000 to DPS for drug scientists and lab supplies, $800,000 to MDH for grants to protect Project ECHO programs, $200,000 for DHS for grants for overdose prevention. All of these make sense. They have correlation, and I'm sure there's many other worthy programs that are not listed here, but that will be hopefully funded through the grants appropriation as well. The additional funding in the bill that comes from the general fund is a different story, especially after the amendment that if we don't collect the funding and the revenue from these fees, it will come from our general fund. And one in particular is the one addressed in my amendment, the $2 million in fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 21 for another $2 million, so $4 million as I understand it, going to DPS for violent crime enforcement team grants. Senator Rosen, why is that funding needed? Why is it related to this bill? Does it solely fund opiate addiction crisis issues, or does it go beyond that?
Senator Rosen will yield. Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Senator Franzen. And this, of course, went through the Judiciary Committee, and we had a very good discussion about the incredible need to get more enforcement, more help out there to stop the trafficking of illicit drugs coming into our state. The violent crime enforcement teams have not seen an increase in their funding since 2011, and it specifically says in the bill placing a priority on funding for non-metro teams and also establishing it more in Greater Minnesota, because those areas do not receive money from the HIDA grants, excuse me, the high intensity drug trafficking areas. Minnesota is 49th state to receive grants, and they've received them for 3 years. Hennepin, Dakota, Ramsey, Washington, and Anoka received these grants, but nothing for Greater Minnesota. So we need to get more folks out there. As I said, there has been a 700% increase on methamphetamine seizures. That's frankly what is impacting my district right along the Iowa border. We've seen synthetic fentanyl coming in. We've seen opiates coming in, heroin coming in, and this is critical to stop that trafficking that's coming into our state that we have no control of. So this is another important tool of this bill. So I extremely oppose this amendment.
Senator Franzen.
Thank you, Mr. President, and Senator Rosen for your clarification. So this, in fact, does not go completely for opiate crisis and opiate addiction and prevention. It goes beyond, and that is my concern with this bill. I'm not questioning whether the funding is necessary, whether rural communities need the funding coming from the general fund. I think that's a separate bill and a separate discussion. I know we mentioned it in HHS when the bill came to our committee, and I questioned it. I thought it was coming directly from the revenue coming from the fees that are collected in this bill, but it seems like it also will permanently put another funding mechanism from the general fund for this area. I just think it's not this bill's, scope. It goes beyond the scope of this bill, and I'm not sure why it's necessary. I can give you a big list of other areas where we can completely have it correlated to this bill: education for treatment centers, recovery at home programs, other programs that are out there, including that would focus solely on crisis prevention when it comes to opiates. But this just seems to be way out of scope, Senator Rosen, and not needed to make this bill work as it is. And that is one of my biggest concerns. People need to know that we're raising fees. We're spending money. The Republicans are raising fees on an industry and spending it, and not just for the areas that we intend to do. And I believe that this is an issue that we need to tackle, but to raise funds and raise revenue from businesses in Minnesota and then to spend it on things that are not related to those fees, I just think that's not the way we should do our policy making. And I have a concern with this fund coming from our general funds, particularly when we just had targets come from the majority party here in the Senate, really slashing funds for HHS at the tune of $300+ million. So where are our priorities? We're going to increase enforcement, but we're not going to treat the illness. We're not going to treat recovery. We're not going to provide education on this issue. I think those priorities are backwards, and I urge members' support of this amendment.
Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Mr. President and Senator Franzen. And I believe, and hopefully, I believe that all of us in this chamber are increasing the licensing fee to a pharmaceutical industry, because there are funds that need to be generated to take care of the needs that this opiate crisis has presented to our state. And to use money for treatment is appropriate. To use money for out-of-home placement costs because of children being pulled out of their homes because of drug abuse is appropriate. I felt and I listened to the law enforcement that said we cannot stop the influx of illicit drugs coming in through our interstates and our highways. We need more people out there to do this law enforcement to stop the raids. All you have to do is pick up a paper, members, in greater Minnesota, and you look at the amount of pounds, what's been rated, it goes on and on. It's a weekly issue. So, members, I adamantly oppose this A50 amendment. I feel that the respect for the law enforcement for what they do and how they protect us and how they have risen to the occasion on a stagnant budget for the last 8 years. This is the least we can do, and this is an extremely important piece of this bill. And, Mr. President, I ask for a roll call.
A roll call has been asked for. A roll call will be granted. Discussion on the A50 amendment. Senator Eaton.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have to agree with Senator Rosen. This money comes from the general fund, and it goes to a good purpose. We have way too many illicit drugs getting into the tribes and the other rural areas in greater Minnesota where some of the worst overdoses are taking place. So I will not support this amendment.
Senator Franzen.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wanted to make a point about this bill. This bill is pretty big, and unless you serve in the committees of jurisdiction and unless you've looked at it every single time it's changed, it keeps changing. It will change again once it goes to conference committee, and I hope that we really talk about how we're picking and choosing what gets funded and what doesn't, and the implications to our budget, as it is a budget year. And again, I want to make the point that we just heard about the Republican budget and how it's cutting services in HHS by the tune of $300 million plus. And again, this has to be put in perspective with this bill and not to be taken in silos. So, Senator Rosen, I really do hope that you reconsider the priorities in this bill. I do support this bill. I just wanted to make this point in front of the body for those of us who have not seen who have not been necessarily taking a look at the bill as it's changed through the body. I do hope that when it comes out of conference and it comes as a better package, and I do support our law enforcement community 100%, and I'm not arguing with the merits of the funding, I'm just arguing why it's in this bill and why can't it stand on its own on a budget bill as it is a budget session. So with that, Mr. Chair, I do withdraw the amendment.
Senator Franzen withdraws the A50 amendment. Members, we're back to the bill. House File 400, Senator Klein.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. You know, I express my tremendous gratitude for Senator Rosen's hard work on this bill and Senator Eaton on the occasion of your daughter's 35th birthday. I expend my gratitude as well, and I hope this body is able to give you a green vote to honor that occasion. This has been a long trajectory for me. I've seen this epidemic from birth to the present time. As a young physician, I recall pharmaceutical representatives from Purdue Pharma coming to my institution and telling us about a new product named OxyContin, which was safe and non-addictive because it would be slow release. We should be prescribing it, and in fact, if we did not, we were negligent. There was a new definition of pain as the fifth vital sign. If we couldn't get pain down to a score of 0, we were doing wrong by our patients. And I know that that was well funded and continued well after the social devastation became apparent. And I'm glad, as Senator Rosen has said, that we are achieving accountability to some extent. There's been some concern that prescribers and others share in that responsibility, and that is absolutely correct. At the end of the day, no matter what a pharmaceutical representative tells you as a doctor, when you sign a prescription, you put your own name at the bottom. We prescribed long-acting and short-acting opioids for chronic osteoarthritis pain, for back pain. We gave out 30-day prescriptions for dental procedures. Mr. President, we were wrong. Prescribers know that, and we have owned it. We've instituted a prescription monitoring program, which is both a real and a practical and a financial cost to us as prescribers. This bill initiates mandatory continuing medical education for all of us, which is both a real and a financial cost for every prescriber. It places limitations on our prescribing authority, which we accept because those are the right things to do and they are good policy. And in fact, at line 2413, it actually poses a $50 fee on prescribers for prescribing opioids in this state. Physicians do own this problem, and I commit to Senator Benson that I will continue to work with her if she feels that we have not fully met our responsibilities, because I do not shrink from them. There is one class of prescriber that is exempt from this bill, and I will continue to work in future sessions on monitoring and supervising veterinary opioid prescribing patterns. As we close loopholes in human prescribing for opioids, more and more access will be obtained from the veterinary prescribing world. We've seen instances where this led to abuse of animals and false representation, and that will have to be the work of future legislators. I commit to working both with Senator Rosen and with Senator Benson on those bills. Thank you again, Senator Rosen, for bringing the bill.
Further discussion on the bill, Senator Jensen.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Klein, and thank you, Senator Benson, for your previous comments. But I would certainly encourage caution in the vein of those comments. We have an elaborate system in this country by which medications get approved. And before we throw physicians under the bus on this one, I have to protest. The DEA and the FDA work together in many ways, but when the Food and Drug Administration get done going through all the various phases of approval and they bring it to us as physicians, we do take those responsibilities seriously. And while I share Senator Klein's comment that we own it, we know that we were perhaps too willing to take over pain management post-operatively after the first 30 days had passed, because our colleagues, the surgeons, knew that we were far more familiar with the ongoing medications that patients were on. Nevertheless, I remember the OxyContin days, and I remember the free ties and the candy bars and the lunch for the staff, and I've said that as well. But I quietly simmered when Senator Benson made her comments about the fact that physicians are not included on paying some money or some licensure fees in this, and Senator Klein's comment put me over the top. So perhaps physicians who have recommended Tylenol should be responsible for the poisoning that occurred in the 1980s. And when many pregnant women came to us wanting thalidomide, and we had held off as a country for a long time, but in Europe it was going further and further forward, and we finally approved it. The DEA and the FDA worked together, and we used thalidomide, and we had children come out with just a fin instead of an arm. We should hold physicians accountable. And when the rotavirus vaccine, the RotaShield, was put out, and some of us were hesitant about it, and it was nevertheless approved, and babies died of bowel obstruction. Maybe we should be held responsible for that. And when Meridia came out, and we were encouraged to use it for weight loss, and an astounding number of people suffered at the hands of that, maybe we should also say physicians should pay a portion. And Quaaludes, oh my stars, Quaaludes were a wonderful drug, weren't they? Yeah, physicians resisted for a long time, and finally, because it was on the market for 23 years, and people were being asked, physicians were being asked, you should prescribe that and help me. So at some point in time, we do need to be careful. We do have stopgap measures in this country. And right now we have another struggle before us, and I won't go into detail on that. But we have the same issue right now with hemp and THC and medical marijuana. And we have, as a body, at this point in time said, we have no need to study that further or discuss that further as a body. And I would encourage this body, in the light of the comments that both Senator Klein and Senator Benson have made, be thoughtful about not asking for more information or putting the task force forward that might get us more information. And regarding the fifth vital sign, Senator Klein is absolutely right. We were accused of being insensitive if we didn't drive someone's pain level down to a 0 or a 1. So I pushed back hard with Senator Rosen when it came time to talk about whether or not physicians should be license, because frankly, there would be a lot of physicians that would wash their hands of it. As it is, we have physicians all across Minnesota that have absolutely changed their prescribing practices. Some are stopping any chronic pain management, I being one of them. I have received cards and notes from patients that are dear to me, asking me why I've abandoned them in their time of need. So I think we need to be careful when we talk in that spirit. Thank you.
Members, if there are no more amendments, I'd like to move to third reading. Are there any other amendments? The Secretary will give House File 400 its third reading.
House File number 400, a bill for an act relating to health.
Third reading. I still have a list of members. Senator Utke is next on the list.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Rosen, for your work on this bill. I think we all agree what we're after for in the end, but there are some of us that maybe are a little concerned with the funding mechanisms. And members, I have sent a letter out that was at everybody's desks today and would just ask that you look at that. I do have one of those generic manufacturers in my district, and so I do have some concerns there. But more we hear about, in some cases, small costs. But I think no matter if they're large or small costs, they're all going to get pushed down to the end user. And that's where my concern is, that we continue to have a stream of these drugs for those that really need them and use them properly. We know people of all ages that are along those lines, but at the same time, we do want to have precautions and stopgaps in there for those that would be abusing them and ending up with all the bad things that we have heard about today. But those of us that can't support it at this point, I just want to say that we support the opioid issue and want to do all we can to stop it, but there might be something related to the funding and such, so thank you.
Final discussion on House File 400, Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. Well, we are in the midst of the opioid crisis that has been so well described here and experienced with loved ones and others. And this crisis is engulfing our nation state by state. Every corner in our state has been affected by this crisis. Every city, town, probably a corner near you. And I'm reminded in the discussion that we had today about the addictive nature of these drugs. And in a sense, that addictive nature was not acknowledged, in fact hidden, from prescribers and Minnesotans. It does remind me of what happened with the tobacco industry. And just as the tobacco industry was called for accountability, and the tobacco settlements came to state by state, including Minnesota, I fully expect and look to that lawsuit that will call those drug manufacturers into account in a settlement that will help pay the costs that have been incurred in this opioid crisis. I do want to mention an aspect of the bill before us today that is a bit different than what we saw last year. And I greatly appreciate Senator Rosen and Senator Eaton's work on this. I do not feel that as elected officials, except for the two doctors that are in our chamber today, most of us do not have the expertise nor the training to tell a physician prescribing limits for patients. That was a problem in the bill that we saw last year. I greatly appreciate the language included in this bill on page 19, lines 5 through 8, which allow exceptions from the prescribing cap for clinical judgment. That's what I expect when I see a physician. That's what we all expect. That's what they're trained for. And I appreciate the fact that the bill before us includes that important provision. I also think of Senator Klein's comments about veterinarians. It is clear that the opioid epidemic is shifting from the medical community to the veterinarian community. I am glad to know that our vets are going to be working on something similar to the prescription drug monitoring program that we have in place with our medical providers. It is essential that we have not shifted to shopping for a veterinarian to prescribe opioids for a pet or an animal from a shelter as a surrogate for the drugs that are needed by that owner. I stand in support of the bill before us. I know that efforts will continue as we move forward on this, but it is time, members, it is past time that we do all that we can to prevent and eliminate the scourge of the opioid addiction that is upon us.
Final discussion on House File 400, Senator Matthews. Senator Ralph.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank Senator Rosen and Senator Eaton for their work. I have some issues. Unfortunately, some of my thunder got stolen as usual. That's what happens when you're a lower person on the poll. But I will make a comment that I certainly appreciate putting the provisions that preserve physicians' judgment. As Senator Nelson so eloquently stated, this is what I go to see a doctor for. I'm not a physician, and I don't want to see a bill that ties their hands completely. The other thing I do wish to speak to, however, that I don't think has really been addressed, and that is, while we've talked about the fact that we have concerns about the funding and where this money is going to come from, I think we do have to keep in mind that this bill does raise revenue. It increases it. That is something we need to be concerned about. I certainly appreciate Senator Rosen and the provisions on the sunset. I think this is absolutely vital that we do not have a provision that raises revenue without some way of re-examining that in the statutory framework. Unfortunately, it's often very difficult to get rid of a revenue provision once it's in statute. So I thank Senator Rosen for doing that. I do have concerns about that funding mechanism, but we have too much of a problem to solve, so I think it's appropriate to take a let's wait and see, but let's be sure we look at it down the road. Thank you. I will be voting in favor of this bill.
Final discussion on the bill, Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, members, I just want to add my voice to the many voices today that have stood up and made public thanks to Senator Eaton and Senator Rosen for your incredible work, working together over these last years, and here we are today ready to vote on an important bill that's going to make a significant difference for the better in people's lives. Members, my sister-in-law is an assistant medical examiner at Hennepin County, and those of you who were on the bonding tour of the medical examiner's offices in downtown Minneapolis maybe saw what we saw, which was that facility is completely over capacity. No storage space, and the examiners are overworked, and the reason being the opioid epidemic and the number of individuals that need to be processed because they've died from addiction. And I've talked to my sister-in-law about that, and she just says you can't even begin to describe how incredible it is, the volume and the numbers that just keep coming through the door. They have no place to put the people, and they're working day and night. Think about that for just a moment, members. We have to build a facility that's much larger than the present facility we have at the cost of many millions of dollars because so many people are dying from this crisis. Members, sometimes we do things, we pass legislation because it really, really matters, and because they cut to the core of our lives and the experiences that we bring to these roles that we serve in this chamber. Like I said before, this bill is going to make such a tremendous difference for the better in people's lives. We heard the stories that Representative Swadzinski told of losing incredible, precious, beautiful, vibrant young people. Members, those families are in pain and they are grieving. And that's very, very real. It's not abstract in the slightest. Senator Eaton, especially thank you. You do your daughter Ariel an incredible, proud tribute today on her birthday. Thank you for bringing the drive and the tenacity and the determination of a loving mother and letting us do this today. Thank you.
Final discussion on the bill, Senator Hayden.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, and I want to thank also Senator Rosen and Senator Eaton for shepherding this bill through. We know that, as we've heard from just about everybody here, irrespective to if you plan to vote for the bill, that they've been touched by this epidemic. I do bring attention. I had sent out a note to the body about this issue, specifically in the African American community. And so, though this issue of opioids, and often in certain communities it's just called heroin, sometimes heroin, depending upon what your pronunciation is. But this issue and this epidemic in the African American community in particular, and some communities of color, have been happening for a long time. Some of you may remember the great singer Billie Holiday, the great jazz singer. She died of a heroin overdose. Some of you might remember John Coltrane, the great bebop saxophonist, another victim to the issue. And we all remember, most of us were here when our hometown hero and friend to many of us, Prince, died of a fentanyl overdose. So the issue, and countless others, I just named them because people might know them, but countless others that have fell prey to the addictive qualities of opioids, or in particular heroin. And so I've talked to Senator Rosen about this, so I didn't offer an amendment today, but I would hope that in our advisory committee, we can add someone from the African American community that would be helping to make some decisions of the extra dollars that will go and target those in those particular communities. I know that the commissioner has some slots that potentially could be utilized, but I think I'd feel much more comfortable. Once again, I've had this conversation with Senator Rosen, and she's developing some language that hopefully, if this bill should go forward, which I think that it will come back from conference with some language that would speak to this. And once again, members, we know that this has touched all communities, and it has kind of hit epidemic proportions in our country over the last few years. But I would also remind members that this issue, this problem, this ideal of opioids and heroin and fentanyl and Oxycontin and all of these kind of things, those things hit communities of color, and particularly African American communities, for a long time. So with some assurances from the bill author, I know that we'll get this together, but I do want to raise it. I will say this, I didn't speak to what I sent around to you, but what it says is that fentanyl in particular, those deaths are up about 110% in the African American community. And what that really means, if you play it out, is that people were using heroin for maintenance and maybe not got the opportunity to kind of get off, or to kind of go to medical assisted therapy and other things that we know work. And they were using that to kind of for maintenance. And because of the change and this influx of fentanyl that has gotten into the population there, the deaths are rising at an astronomical rate. So there's going to need to be specific, clear, cultural understanding of how we use this money in certain communities so that they don't get left behind. So with that, Mr. President, I am going to support the bill. And once again, I've talked to the bill authors about this issue, and I'm confident that if this bill should pass and it comes back from conference, that we'll have something in it specifically that will outline representation from the African American community in the bill.
Final discussion on House File 400, Senator Tomassoni.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to the authors for sponsoring this bill and for the hard work you've done on it. You know, when you hear numbers like in 2017 there were 422 opioid deaths in Minnesota, and then in a county like St. Louis where there's only 200,000 people, there were 23 of those deaths were in St. Louis County, and you read things like Duluth has been identified by authorities as being a ground zero in the relationship to opioid access. All of it becomes very, very personal. And it gets even more personal when you have friends who've lost loved ones and children to overdoses and opioid deaths. And when you have a constituent that comes up to you and asks you to do something about it, and he's carrying a vial of his daughter's ashes in his pocket and a picture of her when she took her last breath, it's really, really hard to ignore. And it makes you say, we got to fix this thing. And I look at some of the things that happen, and I hear studies about the pharmaceutical industry that says, well, let's see, they raised the price of insulin, I don't know by how much. EpiPen's doubled or tripled by I don't know how much. And they will tell you, well, we have to do that in order to keep doing research. And yet a study about the pharmaceutical companies said, well, the only reason that they raise prices and the reason they can raise prices is because they can do it. There's nothing stopping them from doing it. There's nothing that says their numbers have cost drivers that are causing them to do it. There's nothing that says the research they're doing is causing them to do it. They're doing it because they can. And when we hear those kind of things, you think, is this a responsible thing to be doing for our society? And then when you hear about the opioid crisis, and the opioid crisis has gotten completely out of hand, which is why we're here today and why we're doing this bill, and you think, well, wouldn't the right thing to do be to stop manufacturing these drugs? Just stop making the drugs. Of course, you can't do that. They're making way too much money on them. And then they'll tell you that if they're taken the way they're prescribed, they don't cause a problem. But everybody here knows that sometimes just one pill starts causing a problem. And so the right solution would be to not make these anymore. And I imagine it would have to come from the federal government to say it's illegal to manufacture and sell opioids in the country anymore. But I got a funny feeling that isn't going to happen. But it seems to me that would be the right thing to do, because the crisis has gotten too big, and it's a crisis that is of drugs that are sold legally. So I don't know if this bill goes far enough, but I'm going to support it, and I hope that this is a start to stopping a problem that's really, really bad. And I know that people who have had the experience that Senator Eaton has had, and my heart goes out to you, because I know that this is a hurt that never goes away, and I know that you can't ever get over the crisis, and I know the people that I know who have lost children to drug overdoses are experiencing it exactly the same way. And so I once again just want to say, let's get this done, and let's get a start on this, and let's try and figure out how to stop whatever is causing this problem.
Final discussion on the bill, Senator Abler. Final discussion on House File 400, Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd just like to first start off with a couple comments in reaction to several things that were said on the floor that I think were very appropriate, very, very valid concerns. And one is with the generic opiate manufacturers and industry. And frankly, they are an industry of addiction. They are making money off of a drug that does have a lot of power, but they also are making money. And so they need to still be a part of this problem and they need to be accountable for it. And when we address the providers, I think, honestly, they have been so affected by this. The hospitals, for one, with the amount of increase on their ER visits, and they have seen an increase of 16.2% increase for the ER, but for mental health and substance abuse, ER visits have increased by 75%. And providers, they are going to be, they're working with the prescription monitoring program, and they have the education component. And as I said at the beginning, prescriptions of opiates is going down, but as I said, the deaths are going up. Is this bill perfect? No, Mr. President, members, it's not perfect. Is it aggressive? Maybe. But what are we supposed to do? We must react, as Senator Limmer said. We must react to this, and we have reacted in a very responsible, accountable way in House File 400. And it's been frustrating for me, and I'm sure for many of you, that have had people, stakeholders that should be at the table, the pharmaceutical industry, that have come to your office and given many, many different excuses, and that they want to be a part of the solution. And when I asked them, what does that mean? And they're not quite sure, because they don't want to be culpable to this problem. I've said, perhaps you can fund a treatment program. And they've never come to the party with a solution. So we are the responsible ones in this chamber. The cost can be measured at the county level with our out-of-home placement cost, at the treatment cost, what it costs the state, to law enforcement. What we spend just trying to get our hands around the illicit drugs. The cost can be measured in so many ways, but how do you measure the cost of a loved one that has been lost and the families affected? So Ariel, happy birthday to you. And you would be very proud of your mama. She was by my side every step of the way on this bill, and it's been an honor to serve with her. And members, for all of you that have been working on this bill for the last 2 years, I want to also thank you very, very much. And to the stakeholders up there in the balcony, for your story, for your lost loved ones, thank you for being at every single hearing, even Rules Committee. And for all those in the state of Minnesota that have lost somebody or have been affected by this terrible crisis, we are doing what we possibly can in this state. And yes, it is aggressive, but I honestly, every single day I woke up and said, this is the right thing to do. We're only asking for $20 million. $20 million being spent on a very, very important issue. So I also want to thank so many other people. Timble, Andrew Todd Harlan, you guys are amazing. And our nonpartisan research team, Eric Nauman, Dennis Albrecht, Katie Kavanaugh, and Brian Perro. Ruth, thank you so much for being, you guys are very tired of this bill too. It's time to get this done. It's time to get some relief out to our state. So with that, thank you, members. I ask for a green vote.
Final discussion on the bill, Senator Gazelka.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, it's obvious today that we have a problem with opioids in Minnesota and in our country. But finding the solution was much more difficult. And like Senator Rosen said, there's not a perfect solution, but doing nothing, members, was not an option, which is why I've been supportive of this and felt like we needed to move it forward. I came into contact with this with St. Gabriel's Hospital in Little Falls, one of the towns I represent. The fact that they said, we're not waiting for the government, we're not waiting for anybody, we're going to figure out how to do it. And the hospital worked with the school system, worked with the police in the area and said, let's do something about it. And they literally began to drive down the number of prescriptions and the abuse. And that is frankly one of the programs that we're piloting around the state and frankly around the country. And so we can do something, and some of that requires extra resources. So do I think this is a perfect way to do it? No. But I haven't found a perfect way to do it, which is why I'm going to support this bill. But this is also a good sign, as I'm closing, that we in the Senate here have found a way to do a number of things where we're working together: snow days, hands-free, disaster relief, fixing Minlars, the bonding issue that took care of the landfill, quite a few issues that this body has figured out how to work together. And so we're not doing things perfect, but we're doing the best we can and moving a lot of things forward. And I believe today opioid abuse and working on that and a solution moving forward will also happen today. So members, I'm a green vote as well.
Members, we're on final passage of House File 400 as amended. Seeing no further discussion, the Secretary will take the roll on the bill. All senators having voted who have the desire to vote, the Secretary will close the roll. There being 59 ayes and 6 nays, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. No applause in the gallery, please. No applause. No applause. Members will move to the 13th order of business, announcements of Senate interest. Without objection, the following senators will be excused from today's session: Senator Rest all day, Senator Marty from 11:25 to 11:50 a.m., Senator Pratt from 12:15 to 12:25 p.m., and Senator Herr from 12:40 p.m. to the end of session. Members, any announcements of Senate interest? Senator Ruud.
Mr. President, the Legacy Finance Committee will meet immediately in room 15 of the Capitol.
Senator Dibble.
Mr. President, I was rising to a point of personal privilege to make an inquiry of a member who I don't see in the chamber. Senator Newman in the chamber? He knew I was going to ask him
Senator Newman
something.
sneaked out, Senator Dibble.
He snuck out. All right. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Senjum.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have been asked on behalf of our Honorable President Miller that he has today brought to us the famous Blado Donuts from Monona, Minnesota. They're available for senators and staff in room in the Senate office building, room 3414. So, Blado Donuts from Monona, the best in the world.
Don't wait too long until supplies last. Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Jobs and Economic Growth Committee will convene at 1:30.
Members, any other announcements? Senator Tomassoni.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, in 1 week from tomorrow, the long-awaited Iron Ranger Party will be taking off at Mancini's on April 9th at 6 p.m. And just to avoid the long lines, you get your tickets prior to the event from either Laura Bach in room 2235 or Pat Kaluza in the Republican caucus at room 3219. I hope to see you all there.
Members, any other announcements of Senate interest? Senator Gazelka.
Mr. President, members, before we adjourn, just a little roadmap for Wednesday. We're going to meet at noon. We'll do normal business. At this point, there's no bills planned. We will recess till 6 o'clock at night, where we'll come back here organized to go to the House for the State of the State. So, members, or Mr. President, I move the Senate do now adjourn until Wednesday, April 3rd at 12 noon.
Senator Gazelka moves that the Senate do now adjourn until Wednesday, April 3rd, 2019 at 12 noon. All those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. We are adjourned.